He ended up with a fairly large number of children that were unaccounted for, unable to be found. The OIG report, the Inspector General of DHS, found that there were hundreds of thousands of children that they couldn't locate. Doesn't mean they were all lost. It just means they didn't know where they were.
Right.
Is that fair and accurate?
That's totally fair. In the case of Kayla, as an example, he ran away from his sponsor a month after he got to his sponsor, and the government didn't even check on him until after he murdered Kayla. And that was several months later. And so they didn't know where he was. His sponsor never reported it. They never did a wellness check on him to see if he was still with the sponsor himself. And I just look at this and go, what are we doing to ourselves right now? Can we just have a little bit of common sense back into this discussion?
And we were talking about somewhere in the order of 400 and something thousand unaccompanied alien children during.
So here we are again, staring into the abyss of American political discourse in the year of our rapidly declining republic 2025, watching Chip Roy of Texas, that paragon of moral outrage and constitutional fury, sitting in a congressional hearing with his face contorted in what we must charitably assume is genuine concern for vulnerable children, except this particular concern only manifests when it can be weaponized against his political opponents, when it can be marshaled into a battering ram aimed squarely at the Biden administration, at Democratic policies, at the very notion that immigration could be approached with anything resembling humanity rather than military precision, and walls and barbed wire and fear. And wait until you hear what's actually happening beneath this theatrical display, because the contradictions are breathtaking in their audacity, and the manipulation of human suffering for partisan gain is so grotesque it would make Machiavelli himself recoil in something approaching shame. Let's begin with the most explosive revelation you need to understand before we dissect this entire facade, because Republicans began making claims that more than 300,000 unaccompanied children had been lost after the Department of Homeland Security released a report in August which showed that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, did not serve notices to appear in court to 291,000 children between fiscal year 2019 and May 2024, and notice that date range because it's doing some heavy ideological lifting here. Notably, around half of this period occurred when Trump was president, which means that when Roy sits there with his furrowed brow demanding to know where the children are, he's conveniently memory-holing the fact that this supposed crisis began under his own party's watch, under the administration he now slavishly defends, and more importantly, while the DHS report stated that children who do not attend their court hearings can be at a higher risk of being trafficked or exploited, it did not say that the total 323,000 children referenced are unaccounted for or missing, which is to say the entire framing of this hearing is built upon a distortion so fundamental that it transforms administrative tracking challenges into a lurid narrative of children vanishing into some Dickensian nightmare landscape. But here's where it gets even more insidious, and you absolutely need to grasp this before we proceed any further, because the implications are staggering when you actually trace the logic through to its conclusion. According to the report, 32,000 UACs did not appear for court hearings between FY 2019-23 and 291,000 UACs who were not issued NTAs as of May 2024, a total of 323,000 individuals, and what Republicans have done with exquisite political calculation is conflate children who didn't receive immigration court notices with children who have literally disappeared, who have been trafficked, who are in danger, transforming what is fundamentally an administrative and resource challenge, what represents the consequences of our deliberately broken immigration system, into a horror story designed specifically to inflame nativist sentiment and provide political cover for the most draconian enforcement policies imaginable. And then watch what happens next, because this is where the performative outrage reaches its crescendo, where Roy and his witness discuss this case of a child who ran away from his sponsor and then allegedly murdered someone named Kayla, deploying this singular tragedy as if it were representative of hundreds of thousands of cases, as if one horrific incident could justify an entire architecture of cruelty directed at migrants. The witness says the government didn't check on this child until after the murder occurred several months after he ran away from his sponsor. And Roy pounces on this with what appears to be genuine moral indignation, asking, what are we doing to ourselves right now? Can we just have a little bit of common sense back into this discussion? And the sheer audacity of this rhetorical maneuver should take your breath away, because where exactly was this concern when his own party systematically defunded and dismantled the very infrastructure that could conduct these welfare checks in the first place? The fiscal year 2024 congressionally enacted budget for this particular issue, Unaccompanied Children Program, was $100 million less than the prior year, and the president's request, And then for the fiscal year 2025 budget approved by the House Committee on Appropriations, more than $3 billion less than the prior year, and what the president requests, which is to say Republicans in Congress, Roy's own colleagues, the people he caucuses with and strategizes with, actively starved this program of resources while simultaneously demanding it perform miracles of coordination and oversight. But wait, because there's another bombshell coming that exposes the entire ideological framework undergirding this spectacle, because many studies have shown that immigrants are less likely to commit violent crimes than U.S.-born citizens, a fact so consistently demonstrated across decades of research that you would think it might occasionally penetrate the consciousness of people claiming to care about public safety. Yet former President Trump, the GOP frontrunner in 2024, said migrants illegally crossing into the U.S. are poisoning the blood of our country, deploying rhetoric that echoes the darkest impulses of 20th-century fascism, language that would have been immediately recognizable to propagandists in Berlin in the 1930s, thanks to years of repetition of that rhetoric by Trump and his allies. Republicans now broadly think that immigrants in the country illegally are more likely to engage in violent crime, with polling released by Monmouth University showing that nearly 2/3 of Republicans hold that view. And over time, that has helped push higher the percentage of the overall population that thinks immigrants commit more violent crimes as well. Do you see what's happening here? Do you grasp the mechanism by which reality itself is being systematically dismantled and reconstructed according to partisan imperatives? Let's talk about what Roy actually believes about immigration, because his record is instructive in ways that completely undermine his performance of concern in this hearing. Roy is among a number of Republicans who have described immigrants crossing the border as an invasion, using martial language that implies an existential threat to the nation requiring military response. Roy, a hardliner who has led policy for the House Freedom Caucus, asserted that all immigrants in the country who entered illegally must be deported, and has also called for closing the country to legal immigration until undocumented immigrants are deported, which reveals that this isn't actually about protecting children at all, but rather about implementing a maximalist deportation regime that would tear apart millions of families and devastate communities across America. When Roy invokes the case of this murdered young woman, when he deploys her death as a cudgel against immigration policy, he's engaging in what we might call necropolitical theater, the cynical exploitation of tragedy to advance an agenda that has nothing whatsoever to do with preventing future tragedies, and everything to do with stoking fear and resentment toward vulnerable populations. And here's where we need to examine the actual mechanisms by which children in the unaccompanied minors program can end up in dangerous situations, because the reality is far more complex and far more damning of our entire immigration system than Roy's simplistic narrative suggests by law. After unaccompanied minors from foreign countries are detained at the border, they're quickly turned over to the Care Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, which aims to place children in the least restrictive setting that is in the best interests of the child, when it's also protocol for the Refugee Resettlement Office to follow up with sponsors around 30 days after the child's release, but a percentage of these phone calls have gone unanswered during the Biden and Trump administration, which indicates this is a systemic challenge that transcends any single administration's policies, that reflects the fundamental inadequacy of resources devoted to child welfare in immigration contexts. Despite these safeguards, some migrant children have ended up in unsafe situations, though the exact number is not known, which is the actual scandal here. Not that Democrats are deliberately trafficking children as Republican rhetoric increasingly suggests, but that our society has collectively decided that migrant children deserve fewer protections and less oversight than we would demand for any other vulnerable population. Now watch the breathtaking hypocrisy unfold as we examine what Republicans actually did when they had the power to address these concerns, because, according to Inspector General Kafari in 2025 testimony, when asked how many unaccompanied children were lost by the Biden administration, he stated, "I believe the figure is 233,000, and when asked how many unaccompanied children were registered to non-existent addresses or had no address listed at all, Kafari replied, there were 31,000 who had invalid addresses, but here's the crucial question that Roy never asks, and his allies never answer, which is what concrete legislative solutions have Republicans proposed to address sponsor vetting, to increase resources for post-release monitoring, to ensure that HHS and DHS can effectively coordinate their efforts. The answer is essentially nothing except draconian enforcement measures that would make the situation exponentially worse by driving migrants further underground and making children even more vulnerable to exploitation. Let's be absolutely clear about what the evidence actually shows regarding the current administration's efforts, because under the Trump administration, 22,638 unaccompanied children have been located so far, and more than 400 sponsors have been arrested as of September 2025, which Republicans trumpet as evidence of Biden's failures, except this is precisely the kind of follow-up work that requires sustained funding and interagency cooperation, the very things Republicans voted to defund. 27 of the minors were found dead, either by murder, suicide, or drug overdose, according to the Department of Health and Human Services, which is genuinely heartbreaking and should demand a serious reckoning with how we treat migrant children, but instead it becomes fodder for political theater that does nothing to prevent future deaths and everything to justify mass deportation policies that will separate more children from their families. And now we arrive at the most perverse aspect of this entire discussion, which is how Republicans have constructed what they call migrant crime as a distinct category of criminality deserving special opprobrium and special enforcement measures, with Trump telling Fox News, "I don't know if you've heard this, but I came up with this one. Migrant crime, this crime, there's violent crime, there's migrant crime, we have a new category of crime, it's called migrant crime, and it's going to be worse than any other form of crime," literally bragging about inventing a racialized category of crime for political purposes. And the basic claim behind the notion of a migrant crime wave has been repeatedly debunked, with a range of studies by academics and think tanks showing that immigrants do not commit crime at a higher rate than native-born Americans, and a 2023-2024 working paper published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, finding that immigrants have had lower incarceration rates than the U.S.-born for 150 years, and relative to the U.S.-born, immigrants' incarceration rates have declined since 1960, with immigrants today being 60% less likely to be incarcerated. Yet none of this penetrates the conservative media ecosystem or the consciousness of Republican voters, because the narrative has been so thoroughly constructed and reinforced that facts become irrelevant, that statistical reality becomes subordinate to anecdotal horror stories selectively deployed for maximum emotional impact. When Roy sits in that hearing room talking about a child who ran away and committed murder, when he frames this as emblematic of Biden's border policies, he's engaged in what we must recognize as a form of epistemic violence, the deliberate distortion of reality to advance an ideological agenda that treats migrants not as human beings but as threats, as invaders, as fundamentally other and fundamentally dangerous. And the witness sitting next to him plays his assigned role perfectly, acknowledging that the DHS Inspector General found hundreds of thousands of children couldn't locate, but immediately pivoting to doesn't mean they were all lost, it just means they didn't know where they were, which is such a spectacular piece of rhetorical gymnastics that it deserves extended analysis, because what exactly is the difference between being lost and the government not knowing where you are when you're a vulnerable child who crossed the border alone? The actual crisis here, the one that Roy and his Republican colleagues will never acknowledge because it would require them to confront their own complicity in creating it, is that America has deliberately constructed an immigration system designed to fail, designed to create bottlenecks and backlogs and administrative chaos that can then be weaponized for political advantage. The nature of who's coming across the border has changed, with fewer kids coming unaccompanied, who would be released to their parents, and now the majority of these kids are being sent by their parents and living with more distant relatives, family friends, sometimes strangers, and once they're released by the government to these people who are supposed to take care of them, there's no follow-up for the majority of these kids, which represents a policy choice, a decision about resource allocation and priorities, not some inevitable natural disaster that befell the nation. And we need to talk about Chip Roy specifically because he's not some random backbencher, but rather a key architect of Republican immigration policy. House Republicans passed a hardline border security bill last year, shaped by Texas Republicans. The Secure the Border Act would increase penalties for overstaying visas, require migrants to stay in Mexico as they seek asylum, and prevent migrants from seeking asylum outside of ports of entry. The bill went nowhere in the Democratic-controlled Senate, and Roy was a major architect of the legislation, meaning he literally helped design policy that would make it nearly impossible for vulnerable people to seek asylum legally, that would force them into even more desperate and dangerous situations, that would exponentially increase the number of children crossing the border unaccompanied because their parents would have no legal pathway to bring them. This is the man now demanding to know why the government isn't properly tracking and protecting migrant children, the man who has dedicated his political career to making their lives more difficult and more dangerous. Let's examine the sheer cognitive dissonance required to maintain Roy's position, because on the one hand, he claims deep concern for the welfare of migrant children who might be trafficked or exploited, while on the other hand, he advocates for policies that would make trafficking and exploitation exponentially more likely by forcing migrants further into the shadows, by eliminating legal pathways for immigration, by cutting funding for the very agencies tasked with protecting these children. Legal advocates say they're worried the Homeland Security visits signal a return to law enforcement agencies with deportation authority managing immigrant child welfare, with Wendy Young, president of the legal advocacy group Kids in Need of Defense, saying it just inherently creates conflicts, and the tragic result can be the safety of the child, and that much of the activity that this administration is engaging in will drive children further underground and make them more vulnerable to child trafficking, which is precisely what happens when you prioritize enforcement over protection, when you treat immigration primarily as a law enforcement problem rather than a humanitarian challenge. And now we arrive at perhaps the most insidious aspect of this entire spectacle, which is how it functions to absolve America of collective responsibility for the conditions that forced children to flee their home countries in the first place, for the economic policies and military interventions and climate change that have devastated Central American communities, for the drug war that has empowered cartels and made vast swaths of the region essentially uninhabitable, for the century of American imperialism in Latin America that has consistently prioritized corporate profits over human welfare. Roy wants us to believe that this is simply a matter of enforcement, of properly vetting sponsors and conducting welfare checks, as if the problem began the moment these children crossed the border, rather than being the culmination of decades of failed policy and deliberate exploitation. The witness in this hearing says that in the case he's describing, the sponsor never reported that the child ran away, and the government never did a wellness check. And Roy responds with performative exasperation, "What are we doing to ourselves right now? Can we just have a little bit of common sense back into this discussion?" And the answer to his rhetorical question is that what we're doing to ourselves is allowing Republican politicians to gut social services and immigration resources while simultaneously demanding those same agencies perform miracles of coordination and oversight. We're allowing them to transform administrative challenges into moral panics. We're allowing them to exploit genuine tragedies to advance an ideological agenda that will create more tragedies in the future. Common sense would suggest that if you're genuinely concerned about the welfare of migrant children, you would fight for increased funding for HHS, for better coordination between agencies, for more caseworkers and more resources devoted to post-release monitoring. But Roy has done none of these things because his actual goal is not protecting children, but rather constructing a narrative that justifies mass deportation and border militarization. And we cannot allow ourselves to overlook the racial and ethnic dimensions of this discourse, because when Roy and his colleagues talk about illegal aliens and unaccompanied alien children and the invasion at the southern border, they're engaging in what critical race theorists would recognize as racialized threat narratives that position brown and black migrants as fundamentally dangerous, as criminal by their very presence, as undeserving of the protections and considerations we would automatically extend to white children in similar circumstances. Studies have historically shown that immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than U.S. citizens, but this fact is systematically excluded from conservative discourse because it would undermine the entire ideological framework that treats immigration as a security threat, rather than a humanitarian challenge and economic reality. Let's be brutally honest about what Republicans like Roy are actually proposing as solutions to this supposed crisis. Roy asserted that all immigrants in the country who entered illegally must be deported, has called for closing the country to legal immigration until undocumented immigrants are deported, and said our starting place for deportation should be for any individuals who came here illegally or were released into the U.S. illegally, illegitimately, by the Harris-Biden-Mayorkas regime. They need to be removed. They need to be deported. That is the starting place, which would involve forcibly removing millions of people, including children who have known no other home, including teenagers who are fully integrated into American communities, including individuals who are contributing members of society, all in service of an ideological purity that has nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with white nationalism barely concealed beneath a veneer of law and order rhetoric. The reference in the clip to the Biden-Mayorkas regime is particularly revealing in its contempt and its framing of a democratically elected administration as somehow illegitimate, as a regime that has conspired to flood the nation with dangerous criminals, and this is the language of authoritarianism, the language of people who view their political opponents not as fellow citizens with different policy preferences, but as enemies who must be vanquished, as threats to the nation that must be eliminated. Roy has literally compared the Supreme Court's immigration rulings to Dred Scott, suggesting that just as that infamous decision was wrong about the humanity of enslaved people, modern courts are wrong about federal authority over immigration, which is such a grotesque inversion of that history that it should disqualify him from serious consideration as a moral voice on any subject, let alone the welfare of vulnerable children. And here's what makes this entire spectacle so maddening and so dangerous, which is that there are genuine problems with how America handles unaccompanied minors. There are real children who have been placed in unsafe situations. There are legitimate questions about resource allocation and interagency coordination and sponsor vetting that deserve serious examination and serious solutions. But Roy and his Republican colleagues have made it impossible to have that conversation because they've poisoned the discourse with deliberate misinformation and racialized fearmongering, because they've transformed a complex policy challenge into a simplistic morality play where Democrats are cast as villains who deliberately endanger children and Republicans are cast as heroes trying to save them, when the actual reality is that Republicans have systematically voted against every measure that would improve conditions for these children, while supporting every measure that would make their lives more dangerous and more precarious. Recent Trump administration actions appear to be motivated at least in part by recent reporting that some 300,000 UACs are missing, when they simply fail to show up to a hearing or are not served paperwork, making these recent Trump administration actions appear to be based on a false premise or simply intended to ramp up arrests, which gets at the heart of what's actually happening here, which is that the entire construct of missing children has been manufactured as justification for increased enforcement and deportation, for treating migrants more harshly, for implementing policies that will separate more families and traumatize more children, all while claiming to protect them. This is Orwellian in the truest sense, the deployment of language that means its opposite, protection that functions as persecution, concern that manifests as cruelty. So when you watch Chip Roy sitting in that hearing room with his face arranged in an expression of grave concern, when you hear him asking, "What are we doing to ourselves?" as if this crisis materialized out of nowhere, rather than being the predictable consequence of policies he and his party have championed for decades, when you see him deploy the death of a young woman as a weapon against immigration generally, and the Biden administration specifically, you need to understand that you're witnessing political theater of the most cynical variety. You're watching someone who has dedicated his career to making life harder for migrants suddenly discover concern for their welfare, when that concern can be weaponized for partisan advantage. This is not complexity. This is not nuance. This is not good faith disagreement about policy. This is the deliberate exploitation of human suffering for political gain. This is the transformation of vulnerable children into props in a nativist morality play. This is everything that's wrong with American political discourse in this catastrophic moment of democratic decline and rising authoritarianism. And we need to be absolutely clear about what's at stake here, because the narrative that Roy and his colleagues are constructing, this story of hundreds of thousands of children lost by the Biden administration and presumably trafficked or murdered or enslaved, this becomes the justification for the mass deportation regime that Trump and his allies are promising to implement. It becomes the predicate for using military force at the border. It becomes the excuse for even more draconian enforcement measures that will tear apart communities and families across America. The Republican candidate, former President Donald Trump, has largely succeeded in setting the terms of the debate, hammering away at his Democratic rival with hyperbolic claims that she supports open borders and false accusations that the U.S. is experiencing a wave of violent crime committed by migrants, and Trump's insistence that firm measures are needed to address it has become central to the Republican platform, and one of Trump's most frequently repeated campaign promises is that he will deport millions of undocumented immigrants soon after taking office. This is fascism, not in the sense of an abstract political science category, but in the concrete sense of a political movement that defines itself through the demonization of vulnerable outgroups, that constructs elaborate conspiracy theories about those outgroups threatening the nation, that proposes eliminationist solutions involving the forced removal of millions of people, that treats truth as subordinate to political necessity, and deploys lies with such systematic thoroughness that reality itself becomes contested terrain. When Roy sits in that hearing talking about children who couldn't be located, when he transforms administrative tracking challenges into a narrative of deliberate abandonment, when he suggests that the government's failure to conduct a wellness check on one child proves the entire system is broken and must be dismantled, he's laying the groundwork for policies that will create immeasurably more suffering than currently exists. He's constructing the ideological justification for a human rights catastrophe of staggering proportions. And perhaps most frustratingly, the Democrats in this hearing and in political discourse generally have proven woefully inadequate to the task of countering this narrative, have allowed Republicans to define the terms of the debate, have accepted the framing that immigration is primarily an enforcement challenge rather than pushing back with moral clarity about America's obligations to refugees and asylum seekers, about the economic contributions of immigrants, about the humanity of people who cross borders in search of safety and opportunity. The left has allowed itself to be put on the defensive, to be forced into the position of explaining why it's not deliberately trafficking children, to be made to answer for administrative challenges as if they represented moral failures, when the actual moral failure is a political system that treats brown and black migrants as less than human, that views them as problems to be solved rather than people deserving dignity and protection. So when that witness in the hearing says the government didn't know where they were, but that doesn't mean they were all lost, he's trying to introduce a distinction that Roy and the Republicans will never accept, because the entire point of this exercise is to collapse that distinction, to transform uncertainty into horror, to make didn't know where they were synonymous with trafficked and murdered, to create a moral panic that can justify any level of enforcement no matter how cruel. And the tragedy is that there are children who genuinely are in danger, who have been placed with sponsors who abuse them or exploit their labor, who are suffering in ways that should command our urgent attention and our concrete action. But Roy and his colleagues have made it impossible to address those genuine problems because they've weaponized them so thoroughly for partisan purposes that any serious policy discussion becomes impossible. This is what late-stage capitalism combined with resurgent nationalism produces, this grotesque spectacle, where vulnerable children become political footballs, where their suffering is instrumentalized for partisan advantage, where the very people who have dedicated their careers to making their lives more difficult suddenly discover concern for their welfare when that concern can be deployed against political enemies. This is what happens when a society loses any sense of collective responsibility, when we've so thoroughly internalized neoliberal logic that even the most vulnerable among us become commodities in political markets, when every human tragedy must be immediately processed through partisan frameworks and transformed into ammunition for culture war battles. And those of us who still believe in justice, who still maintain that another world is possible, who refuse to accept this nightmare as inevitable, we need to see this hearing for what it is, not a good faith effort to protect children, but rather a cynical exploitation of their suffering, not a serious policy discussion, but rather political theater designed to justify cruelty, not concern but rather contempt, dressed up in the language of law and order. This is the fire next time. This is the warning that went unheeded. This is what happens when we allow demagogues to capture democratic institutions and transform them into instruments of persecution. And if we don't fight back with every tool at our disposal, if we don't expose this cynicism for what it is, if we don't build a mass movement capable of defeating this authoritarian politics and replacing it with something genuinely humane, then Roy and his ilk will succeed in implementing their vision of America as a fortress nation that treats migrants as invaders and children as collateral damage in partisan warfare, and we will all bear responsibility for the catastrophe that follows.